Okay, he says, indeed, the probabilities argue against any such outcome, that is, the emergence of life by chance. That is the whole point of the argument. But then the evolutionists may counter that it did happen because we're here. Like Huxley said, after all, it has happened. This is circular reasoning at its worst, Batten says. Note several other things about these analogies. First, creationists do not argue that life is merely complex, but that it is ordered in such a way as to defy a natural explanation. The order in the proteins and DNA of living things is independent of the properties of the chemicals of which they consist, unlike a crystal of salt, where the structure results from the properties of the salt molecule. The order in living things parallels that in printed books, where the information is not contained in the ink or even in the letters, but the complex arrangement of letters which make up words, words which make up sentences, sentences which make up paragraphs, paragraphs which make up chapters, chapters which make up books. These components of written language respectively parallel the nucleic acid bases, codons, genes, operons, chromosomes, and genomes which make up the genetic programs of living cells. Next, the order of living things shows that they are the product of intelligence. The result of the lottery draw is clearly the result of a random selection, unless family members of the lottery supervisor constantly win. Then we would conclude that the draw has not been random. It is not the result of a random process, but the result of an intelligent agent. Next, the arrangement of cards resulting from shuffling would not normally suggest anything other than a random process. However, if all the cards were ordered by their suits from lowest to highest after we shuffled them, we would logically conclude that an intelligent agent arranged them, or stacked the deck in card-playing parlance, because such an arrangement is highly unlikely from genuine shuffling, a random, non-intelligent process. I mean, if you shuffled cards in front of somebody and then showed them that it was perfectly ordered by suits and numbers in the deck, would they believe that would anybody believe that it actually happened by you randomly shuffling? That's right. They'd all assume that you did something to rig the deck. The arrangement of sand grains in a pile would not normally suggest it resulted from intelligent activity rather than natural processes. However, if all the sand grains were lined up in a single file or were in a great pyramid, we would attribute this to an intelligent agent or a machine made by an intelligent agent, as this would not be likely from a natural process. Next, the arrangement of people crossing a busy street would not normally suggest anything other than a random process. However, if all the people were ordered from shortest to tallest, or some other ordered arrangement, we would suspect that an intelligent agent was responsible for putting them in this order, that it did not result from chance. If 20 people were arranged from the shortest to tallest, the odds of this happening by chance are less than 1 in a billion, 10 to the 18th. So it would be reasonable to conclude that such an ordered arrangement was not due to chance, whereas there would be nothing to suggest intelligent involvement if there was no meaningful pattern to the arrangement of people. Many scientists today claim that an invisible, intelligent cause is outside the realm of real science. These scientists have redefined science as naturalism. Nature is all there is. However, scientists recognize the evidence for an invisible, intelligent agent when it suits them. Now think about this. For example, forensic science determines if past events were the result of accident or plan and purpose. In other words, who done it? The Piltdown 8-man fraud was discovered after some 40 years and hundreds of postgraduate research theses. When researchers had the opportunity to examine the original bones and not just replicas, they noticed file marks on the teeth. Such marks do not happen by natural processes, and the researchers recognized the involvement of a human intelligent agent, a hoaxer. Likewise, United States taxpayers have spent millions of dollars in funding the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. If those listening hear a radio signal with random noise, it is clearly the product of a natural process. But if there was a pattern such as dit, 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 da, 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 dit, 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 it will be hailed as evidence for an intelligent, although invisible source. If such evidences indicate an intelligent source, then surely the incredible amount of information in the DNA and living things, on the DNA and in living things, equivalent to a library of 1,000 volumes in a human being, shouts creation by creator. The more we know about the biochemical workings of living cells, the stronger the evidence becomes for the intimate involvement of a creator. We are indeed fearfully and wonderfully made, and no amount of illogical or irrelevant analogy will counter the clear evidence for this. It's an excellent article answering that farcical charge about random things do happen. Therefore, evolution has happened. The next article I want to share with you, and this is pretty well going to wrap it up, is an article on creation. I'm not even going to give you the source because I don't happen to like the source, and I don't want to in any way endorse the source. But it's not me. I'm reading somebody else's article, but I don't care to identify where I got it. It's called The Questions Evolution Can't Answer. And it's going to deal, once he gets through the introductory remarks, he's going to deal with the so-called evolution of the red-headed woodpecker, and first the evolution of a fish called the archerfish. Yeah.
Is the man an evolutionist?
No, he's a creationist, but he's not a Christian, and it's a cult, and I don't want to endorse the cult. Okay. All right. If you know who it is, fine. If you don't know who it is, you don't need to know. Okay. Here's a quote. He starts out the article with a quote which says, "At the moment, we have to confess that our ignorance of the actual creation is more or less complete." Unquote. The ignorance is more or less complete. You got that? Shocking words? No, quite commonplace among astronomers. The quotation came as a summary of the views of Drs. John Shakeshaft and Peter Scheuer of Mullard Radio Astronomy Observatory in Cambridge, England. The astronomers were being interviewed over BBC. Under discussion were current theories of the origin of the universe. The astronomers showed how one more of the theories had been recently discarded, that of the steady state or continuous creation theory, which had caused so much discussion. This article was written, by the way, in 1966, and so it's almost 30 years old, and so it's referring back to even prior to this. He says, does the average layman know that astronomers, geneticists, physicists, biologists, chemists, paleontologists, and geologists sometimes disagree among themselves over the various hypotheses advanced in support of evolution? Probably not. Evolutionists, of course, view such disagreement as a healthy sign of progress. Admittedly, progress is in an uncertain direction, but progress, they say, nevertheless. For example, a blue-ribbon meeting of scientists recently gathered for a 2-day symposium in Philadelphia. By agreement at the beginning, they agreed that there be no discussion of the influence of God or any form of supreme being in their 2-day symposium. Yeah. How about that? He says they had agreed in advance not to clutter up the arguments by any possible idea of a supreme being. The results of the meeting, they attacked Darwinism. They showed how the theory of evolution as it presently stands is incomplete, but just what was missing, they didn't say. But let laymen attack Darwinism. Evolutionists would lift up hands of horror and disbelief for one who is not qualified to give an opinion, for one who has not agreed in advance to keep all ideas of divine being out of the discussion. To challenge evolutionary thought is not fair. It is not abiding by the tacit rules of scientific thinking, quote unquote. But is such an approach truly objective? Is it the truth they seek? What about you? Do you ever sincerely wonder about life? Do you ever look at the breathtaking marvels of all around you, the limitless sky, the vastness of incomprehensible space, the myriad life forms? Do you ever look and wonder? He then subtitles the next section, Evolutionists Keep God Out of the Discussions. Evolutionists have generally agreed among themselves not to open up to question the whole framework of evolution. Notice an outstanding example. Quote, "How did it all begin?" unquote, asked a geologist in an article directed toward oil drillers. quote, several theories as to the origin of the raw material from the earth was formed do exist and are quite reasonable, he explained. Then came the decision to avoid issues and questions. Notice it, quote, as we must use something as a starting point, and as we want to avoid stepping into the realm of theology and philosophy, we shall use as our beginning the time in the history of the earth when it may have consisted only of a gigantic, turbulent cloud of gas, unquote. The writer goes on and says now, it is significant that the most popular idea for the origin of the earth is it significant that the most popular idea for the origin of the earth is described as a huge cloud of gas? Why not step into the realm of theology and philosophy? Why not be willing to question a theory which has not been proved? Why not look at the marvels of nature and ask specific, positive, practical questions about how evolution could have taken place? Evolutionists seek to avoid such practical questions. They agree before beginning discussions about evolutionary thought to keep God out of their picture. What a remarkable fulfillment of what Paul was inspired to write when he wrote, excuse me, I got to turn to the back of the magazine to find the rest of the article. When he wrote, quote, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind. That's Romans 1:28. And these ancient philosophers of whom Paul wrote were among the very earliest evolutionists. But it's about time that you threw out your mind all prejudice against God and against His knowledge. Take a look at some of the marvelous creatures in this earthly environment of yours and ask yourself some logical, simple, rational, scientific questions about them. How can evolution be true? How did these life forms develop? How did these creatures survive? How could all present life forms have gradually evolved from brown seaweed, or from trees, or from an amoeba, or from flatworms? Now he's going to allow a look at two different life forms to ask these questions. The first one is the amazing archerfish. Has anybody ever heard of an archerfish before? Archerfish shoot from underwater a stream of water and knock bugs off of leaves hanging above the water in order to bring food down for themselves. He says, look carefully at our beautiful color illustration of one of the breathtaking marvels of nature, the one I just held up for you. The archerfish is only one example out of more than 1,300,000 cataloged species on this earth. In every one of those 1,300,000 cases, there is a special, interesting life story. In every case, there are special methods of nest building, of protection through camouflage, of coloration, of mating and breeding, of migrating, or of food-getting techniques. Every creature has different methods for survival, which evolution cannot explain. The little archerfish is given its name because of its phenomenal ability to shoot down his meals from overhanging branches above the water. Strange anatomical and behavioral characteristics make this beautiful little fish one of the most perplexing problems to evolutionists. The archerfish, or T. ejaculatrix, or for ejaculator fish, is of the genus Toxotes, another Greek word for archer, is nature's version of the Polaris submarine. The fish lives in coastal saltwater, brackish waters of swamps, or freshwater estuaries, rivers, and streams. It is native to Indian and Southeast Asian waters and found even in northeastern Australia. A small fish, it attains a maximum size of only about 7 inches. From the moment of birth, the archer distinguishes himself as one of the most unusual of all creatures. Babies are gregarious, and since they live in oftentimes murky, brackish waters, they shine with bright, luminous spots resembling tiny green fluorescent lamps. Researchers surmise this luminosity helps the tiny fish keep contact with one another in the dark, muddy waters. The archer's wide-eyed stare is because his eyes are so remarkably more complex than those of most fish. He is equipped with binocular vision, just like humans. While his eyes are on the sides of his head, he can swivel them sufficiently to see one image in front or above. Archers with one eye gone because of parasite injury continually shoot their jet of water too far to one side, depending on which eye is lost. and are even unsuccessful in jumping clear out of the water to reach food. The retina of the archer's eye is much more complex than that of most fish, having a very large number of cones and rods. But even in this, the archer is still more complex. The cones, the tiny tissues of the retina of the eye, which act as microscopic focusing devices, number only 8 or 9, since they're for daytime vision. But the rods for vision in muddy or dark water number 217. It has been proved archerfish can extinguish cigarettes in total darkness with their instinctive jet of water. I like this little guy. As the little fish develop, they begin spitting at numerous targets above the water in their natural habitat. At first, the tiny fish succeed in squirting their jet only 2 or 3 inches. Later, as adults, they will spurt a stream of water as far as 15 feet. Normally, the adult archer shoots down his prey at a range of only 3 or 4 feet, however, and the jet of water carries its flat trajectory only about 22 inches. What makes this fish shoot down his prey? Ichthyologists, that's a fancy word for fish doctors, have discovered a tiny groove in the roof of the archer's mouth. When the tongue, which is hard and bony, is compressed against the roof of the mouth, the water forced through the mouth by a sudden snapping shut of the gill covers, the water squirts out of the gun barrel-like groove, usually striking its target the first time at distances up to 2 or 3 feet. When did the first archer fish decide to shoot down his prey? When it had to? You know, the evolutionary theory, after all. If the archer had to develop his remarkable Polaris ability, are we to assume it did so because it was necessary for his survival? If that could possibly be true, then how did all the other fish who swim side by side with the archer and who always feed on the bottom, in the water, or at the surface, how did they survive? Are we to assume that the archer was the only survivor? But such theories are only idle guesswork and, pardon the expression, don't hold water. What really baffles evolutionists about the archerfish is that its spouting is not its primary food-getting method. It doesn't need to spout. The archer feeds on the bottom, jumps clear of the surface to take in insects on the wing, or feeds on objects which sink a few inches into the water. No vague theory of the survival of the fittest can possibly account for the unique ability of this marvelous little fish. And no imaginings of supposed mutations could ever possibly account for it. Many vain thinkers allow themselves to indulge in careless, idle speculation. They daydream in their own minds various fictitious ways in which this special food-getting apparatus could have evolved. One might theorize that one day, long ago, a little archerfish made his very first attempt at spitting, but he succeeded, since his special apparatus had not yet developed fully, only in gurgling a tiny few drops above the surface. Then what did he do? Keep trying and trying and trying until he finally succeeded? But the archerfish, remember, does not need to obtain his food by spouting a well-aimed jet of water. Further, an archer does grow tired after several spouts and will rest before trying again or leaving his spouting efforts until later. Evolution demands the development of highly specialized food-getting apparatus could come only through beginning mutations and gradual development over interminable years of time. Even given enough time, they reason anything could happen. But the archer didn't need his special vision if he weren't spouting jets of water high above the water. He couldn't spout streams of water accurately until he had the vision. He couldn't solve the problems of parallax until his trajectory and distance of spouting had been established. And that trajectory and distance could not have been established until his whole spouting mechanism had been perfectly formed. But his spouting mechanism could not have been perfectly formed, including his hard, bony tongue, his little groove in the roof of his mouth, his specially built large forward-focusing eyes, with their unusual number of cones and rods for vision in and above brackish waters, until he really needed it formed to survive. But the archer doesn't need to spout to survive. No amount of guesswork, idle speculation, hazy notions, or daydreams are going to explain away this little marvel of what people call nature. Not by a long shot. Of water, that is. For sake of time, I'm going to skip the rest of that article. He does similar things all the way through there with different things. I want to get to the woodpecker here because I want to be sure to finish that, and it's going to be hard to get that done here, I think, before we run out of time. So let me do this first, make sure we get time. He now shifts to the woodpecker. He says, what makes a woodpecker peck wood? Or, how much wood can a woodpecker peck? One of the most interesting sights you'll probably recall from childhood experience was a woodpecker hammering furiously against a tree. Anyone who has spent much time in the woods in almost any part of the United States has heard the familiar rat-a-tat-tat of a woodpecker banging his sharp, stout beak against wood. Woodpeckers have some of the most remarkable habits of all living things. They're another amazing example of highly specialized creatures who obtain their food in a very unusual manner. One ornithologist, that's a bird doctor, told of seeing a woodpecker land on his favorite oak tree. That is the ornithologist's favorite oak tree. Seeing the blurred head as the bird furiously hacked clouds of splinters and sawdust out of his favorite tree, the man shouted at the bird, then decided to girdle the part of the tree the woodpecker had attacked with a heavy wire mesh in an attempt to discourage it. But the woodpecker was soon back. This time the man found the wire mesh in shreds, and the bird busily drilling deep into his tree. Finally, however, after finding the going a good bit tougher through the wire, and after being frightened away repeatedly, the bird was heard by the owner of the tree drilling away on trees more distant in the forest. Several years later, he reports a severe storm snapped his beautiful oak tree right where the woodpecker had been drilling. Deep within the trunk, the ornithologist discovered a big colony of carpenter ants and a labyrinth of galleries they had gnawed inside it. It was then the man decided that if he had permitted that woodpecker to clean out that ant nest, he would still have his beautiful oak tree, only made more rustic by the familiar drilling of the bird family's answer to the jackhammer, the woodpecker. How did the woodpecker know those ants were deep inside a tough old oak? Why does a woodpecker obtain his food in the most difficult manner possible? Could woodpeckers have evolved gradually, learning to survive in the only way possible for them, pecking deep into tough trees? There are many different species of woodpeckers, 179 in the world and 22 of them in North America. They range in size from the huge pileated woodpecker, 19 inches from the tip of his tail to the tip of his beak, about the size of a crow, to the tiny downy. Each species finds its food in a slightly different fashion and feeds on different things. The little downy feeds on caterpillars found in small twigs and tiny crevices, while the red-headed woodpecker, the one with which most people seem at least partly familiar, that's Woody Woodpecker, they feed on ants and grubs inside the trees. The gaudily decorated pileated woodpecker can strip the bark completely from a tree. One ornithologist watched the huge pileated remove 30 feet of bark from a tree in less than 15 minutes. They can remove the bark from a tree that has been attacked by carpenter ants, thus preventing the spreading of the ants to other healthy trees nearby. The flicker, named because of the flash of white color on its wings in flight, is that the one we saw the other day, Scott? Feeds on or near the ground, lapping up ants with its sticky tongue. The woodpecker is totally different from other birds. First, and most obvious, is his beak. It is straight, very hard in comparison with most birds, and pointed. The head is constructed differently too. The skull is much thicker than other birds, and the skull and beak are moved, sometimes at more than 100 times a minute, by powerful muscles. Bones between the beak and skull have their own built-in shock absorbers, being constructed differently than those of other birds, which are usually directly joined together. Rather, in the woodpecker family, the beak and skull are joined by connective tissue that is spongy and elastic. Every part of the woodpecker's anatomy is specially constructed for the sole purpose of drilling into wood. Their claws are divided into 2 sharp and powerful forward toes and 2 backward like a pair of ice tongs for gripping the bark. Their tail feathers act as a brace, steadying the bird on a firm tripod as it whacks away. The tail feathers are unusually strong, and during molting season, the main propping feathers do not fall out until other feathers have already been replaced, and can support the weight of the bird while the bigger, stronger feathers molt. How do they locate their food? Once a pileated was observed whacking away in a tough old hickory. That's hard. Ants were using a little knothole as an entrance to the tree, but the bird ignored the knothole. Instead, it began pounding on the trunk as it slowly circled the tree, tapping, then pausing. Then it drilled its way into the very heart of the ant nest, 5 feet below the knothole where the ants were entering. Ornithologists speculate that woodpeckers use their acute sense of hearing, another remarkable part of their anatomical structure, to locate the insects either by hearing the insects or else detecting the subtle differences in the sounds of the wood over the insect channels, or both. The woodpecker's tongue is perhaps its most remarkable instrument. In most cases, it is barbed, and about 4 times as long as the beak. The woodpecker snakes his tongue in and out of his beak like a snake's tongue. In some species, the tongue is coated with a sticky substance used as bait to catch ants. A woodpecker will drill into a tree, then snake out its long, sticky tongue, waiting until the ants, believing it to be a worm invader, swarm all over it. The woodpecker then whips the unsuspecting ants into his mouth. 3 woodpeckers were being studied in a cage by ornithologists when they had decided to attempt an experiment. The experimenters tried holding food above and behind the birds' heads and were astonished when the birds whipped their tongues up over their heads, snatching the food away without looking around or turning their heads. Every different woodpecker performs a special service in policing a balanced forest. As an article in American Forest by Peter Farb said, woodpeckers are the only creatures to spend most of their waking hours banging their heads against wood. They do this because of the role they seem to have been assigned in the living community. I like that. Seem to have been assigned. To glean insects from under the bark of trees. Yes, seem to have been assigned, but by whom? Said the article, quote, they are the only things able to locate and eradicate these insect hordes, unquote. But when did the very first woodpecker decide to peck wood? In the vague guesswork of evolution, coming to grips with such practical questions is rarely, if ever, done. But think about it. If woodpeckers evolved, as evolutionists say they did, how did they? Let's imagine, if we can, the very first attempt of a woodpecker to peck wood. Remember, if evolution happened, it had to start somewhere. What made that first woodpecker, or would-be woodpecker, decide to peck wood? Was it necessary for him to survive? But how could that be? Millions of other birds are still with us, and they obtain food on the ground, on shrubs and leaves, in the air, in the water, or, like as not, from the backs and mouths of animals. Why peck wood? But, for whatever reason, let's assume our first would-be woodpecker did decide to peck wood. How did he know there was any food inside a tree? He didn't see it, didn't have his highly acute hearing to hear it. He didn't have his shock-absorbing cartilage between his beak and his head. His head wasn't yet thicker than other birds, and his beak wasn't yet stronger, longer, or sharper. His tail feathers had not yet somehow decided, quote-unquote, to molt in special order so he would always have his ready-made prop under him. And his tongue was just a little short thing up inside his beak like most other birds. But here is the poor little would-be woodpecker about to peck wood. Pick a tree, any tree. Don't even pick a hickory like modern woodpeckers often do. Pick a softer tree, say an elm. He begins banging away. Ouch! Can you imagine it? The forest floor littered with dead and dying would-be woodpeckers who broke their beaks, dislocated their necks, shattered their heads, or broke their tail feathers and were rendered unable to fly. Perhaps others fly wildly about in throes of blinding, dizzying, wrenching headaches, crashing blindly into trees. For millions, no billions of years this continues. No woodpecker obtains his food from a tree, for he hasn't yet developed all the elaborately specialized equipment he needs. All woodpeckers keep dying. None survive. They don't survive for several reasons. First, they must obtain those ants and grubs inside the trees to survive. That's the assumption of the evolutionists. Or they wouldn't be doing this. And they can't develop all their special apparatus for food getting until they need to. And if they need to, they'd better hurry, because birds have a rapid metabolism and must eat more, proportionate to body size and weight, than almost any creature. But they keep killing themselves in the attempt. Some are stuck in cracks, pulling with futile struggles to free their beaks, caught in a stiff old oak. Others die of migraine headaches. All the rest die because they can't build nests. You see, woodpeckers build their nests inside trees. But they don't pick up. They don't pick old hollow trees. Rather, they hammer their own hole in a tree. When they build their nest, they drill their own hole. Granted, the tree can be partly hollow, or have a knot hole to start on, or have an ant colony inside it, but chisel away they do, and they had to start sometime. The woodpeckers, who are not yet woodpeckers, keep dying. None survive. As the succeeding generations keep attempting to peck away, one little woodpecker, who doesn't exist since none survived, since they couldn't survive if they failed to obtain their food from inside the trees, finally developed all the amazing special adaptive requirements for being a true, honest woodpecker. Sound logical? Is it credible? Can you believe it? Before I go on, he should have added in there, so he finally developed all this, and he went looking for a mate. He didn't find one. Apparently, vague guesses and notions, idle daydreams and opinions, hazy ideas and hypotheses are able to set this question aside too. Mutations can't explain away the woodpecker. Vague ideas about birds cleaning their beaks on limbs and just accidentally beginning to peck lightly on trees won't explain it. And remember, about 99 out of 100 mutations produce inferior creatures not equipped as well to survive. That's, by the way, giving great benefit of the doubt to the evolutionary theory, to say 99 out of 100. No, millions of woodpeckers in the world have pecked holes in the theory of evolution. It's about time you got back to the trunk of the tree, just like the woodpecker does, and prove to yourself God created. Every one of the hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of species of life on Earth has its own special story, and every one of them should be studied, thought about, and pondered. The amazing life forms around you are made to be appreciated, admired, and enjoyed. But unless you can constantly rejoice in the love, warmth, and beauty your Creator has put all around you, continually recognizing His great designing ability, His humor and wit, God's humor and wit, God's perfect planning and great creative power, you are missing out on some of the truly savory moments of this life God has given you. Do you know of some interesting and unusual creatures? Have you ever wondered what makes a spider spin, or how eggs are formed, or why deer have hollow hair? Have you any interesting creature you'd like to see pictured? And he goes on to say, hey, write us a letter and we'll do it. He's telling about a future article. He says, soon we'll tell you about the mysterious Australian brush turkey with nature's most remarkable thermostat and anableps, a little creature who walks on water, and show you more of the wonders and marvels of God's great creation. Worship God. He made the earth and every creature in it. Okay, I've got a little bit of time left. Let me go back and read the rest of the material on the archerfish if I can fit it in. By the way, here's a little picture they drew of the woodpecker pecking wood. You can all look at that later on if you want. It's a little cartoon version of the woodpecker. Okay, let's see here. Where did I leave off?
What's interesting is, yeah, they had a lot of good articles. And I had a whole bunch of them, little booklets and stuff like that too. Mm-hmm. And it was really cute, the explanation they have of a lizard turning into a bird. Mm-hmm. That was great.
Yeah.
Here's one that did everything, got the perfect wings and the perfect feathers and all this and that and all this migration system and all that. And oh, here comes something to eat them. So they jump off the cliff. Flat. Got to evolve hollow bones.
Yeah. Okay, picking up where I left on the archerfish, he says, no amount of guesswork, idle speculation, hazy notions, and daydreams are going to explain away this marvel of what people call nature, not by a long shot of water, that is. But look at the methods used in avoiding the whole issue. Here is a direct quote from one of the most thorough and comprehensive reports on the archerfish available, written by an ichthyologist who devoted himself to extensive research, anatomical study through dissection, and experimentation with the archerfish. He says, quote, this, the fact that the archer does not need to depend on spouting for his food, raises an interesting question for evolutionary theory. Spouting, if it's so important, can hardly have been a significant factor in the survival of the species or in the selection and differentiation within the species, unquote. The next statement in the article about this marvelous creature was, leaving this question aside, it is true the archerfish does spout and knock down insects, unquote. Leaving the question aside, we're not going to answer that. And then the writer of this article says, but why leave it aside? Simply because it cannot be answered. Notice, spouting is admitted to be of no real importance to either the survival of the species or to the selection and differentiation within the species. That means no evolutionist can try to explain away the archerfish by claiming one ancient parent had, through mutations, only a tiny part of the fantastic apparatus required for spouting, and that the ancestor happened to mate with another who had another tiny part, and then their babies happened to mate with some archers who weren't archers then, who had some other tiny part, and so on. The noted ichthyologists who studied the fish make no such claims. Why? Simply because God goes beyond the known and positive laws regulating mutations. By such vague reasoning, humans with long noses could in a few generations rival elephants. Yes, the archerfish does spout, even though he does not need to. But the spouting is more complex than just squirting a jet of water. First, the little fish must solve the problem of refraction. Refraction is the bending of light rays as they enter the water, causing objects to appear where they are not. Any boy who has thrown rocks into a clear stream has seen refraction. But the archerfish solves the problem each time with remarkable accuracy. Tests have shown the little fellow even pinpoints his spout. With such care, he blasts insects away from a perch to which they would cling. For instance, when an insect is crouching on the side of a trunk, the fish would aim the jet of water directly beneath the insect, thus dislodging it from the glass. I said the side of a trunk, I mean the side of a tank, rather than hitting it on the back and only succeeding to get it wet. Not only does the archer solve the refraction problem, but he also solves immediately the parallax problem. Parallax is the difference between the location of the fish's eyes in relationship to the target and the location of its mouth. Again, the little spouter performs with hardly a miss. This led one ichthyologist to suggest the fish must have a truly remarkable trigonometric rangefinder in its brain. Well, no doubt. What a dilemma to the evolutionist. The archer does spout, but he didn't need to spout, and therefore did not gradually develop this remarkable anatomy, these fantastic eyes, that tiny groove in his mouth, and his hard, bony tongue in order to survive. No, the archer didn't develop anything. He was created. He was given instinct by the all-wise divine creator being who gives you every breath of air you breathe. The archer is not just an automatic squirt gun. He's a little living creature who makes mistakes and grows tired. He's been known to shoot at almost anything within reach of his deadly accurate stream of water, and even shot one researcher right in the eye when the batting of the man's eye attracted the eyelids attracted the little fish. Such a highly complex living testimony to the tremendous handiwork of your Creator ought to be admired and enjoyed. We should come to see more of the love, warmth, and even humor of our God in these little creatures, not the idiocy of no-God theories. The unanswerable ability of the archerfish says the theory of evolution is all wet, shot down by a tiny creature made by the great God of the universe. And then I'll just show you another article, which we won't take time to read because we don't have the time, put out by the same people in a later issue called The Bombardier Beetle Blasts Evolution. And it's got some pictures here of the bombardier beetle that squirts hot chemicals at just around the boiling point of water at anything that it's going to attack it or be a problem to it. In this picture, there's some tongs grabbing his leg, and he squirts right at it there in a direct shot at it. And the other picture shows where the tongs are grabbing the back leg, and it changes the direction of the shooter. You can squirt very accurately with this chemical. But this chemical it's got in its body is in two different compartments because when it's mixed together it gets really hot and dangerous. And it has this shooter that combines these two chemicals together as it shoots and squirts it out and does terrible things to its enemies. And called the bombardier beetle. It's absolutely fascinating and amazing, God's creatures in creation, and how every one of these animals, if a person would study it from the standpoint of asking these kind of questions, you would have to draw, if you're reasonable, draw the conclusion that somebody designed these animals this way, these creatures, and all for their unique purposes, and even in some cases with no apparent purpose. Just for variety, God has put these things there. like with the archerfish, who doesn't have to shoot its prey down in order to eat and survive. Creation itself, all, as the Scripture says, testifies to who God is. In fact, yeah, God has a tremendous sense of humor in all of this. But in Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 18, it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them," within these people who've rejected God, "for God made it evident to them." So first, God has put in the hearts of all men an inherent knowledge, a priori knowledge of himself. All men just know in their hearts that God is. Then it says, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature." Now that's, the kind of things, the invisible things that make God God, and the nature and true character of God, as opposed to the heathen of the world who are worshiping idols and stones and sticks that they've carved into gods. Okay, but the truth about God, the invisible attributes, eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, through creation, through all these creatures that God has created, through the trees, through the stars, the universe. Everything that God has created testifies to the truth of him, so that it's even understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. But what do men do? For even though they knew God in the sense of knowing about God and the truth about him, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but became futile in their speculations. Doesn't that describe evolution? And their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. But God has told us and said that he has created in such a way that the creation itself shows the truth of him to all men, so that all men are without excuse. All men can and know and understand the truth about God in his invisible divine attributes just by looking at creation itself. But men don't want God, and they come up with these futile speculations about where it all came from, because it's such a powerful testimony to God, they got to try to explain it away. They can't just ignore it. They can't just simply say, well, I don't want God. That's too much guilt's attached to that. They have to try to justify their rejection of God by explaining away what God has created, by writing it off as some accident of and chance occurrence in quote-unquote nature, whatever that is. And so they worship Mother Nature. They replace God with his own creation. And they worship the creation, Mother Nature, instead of God himself. I trust that this series, as long as it's dragged on to be, has been a blessing to you in seeing and understanding the truth of God's creation, the truth of the lie of evolution, and that there is not one thing out there that compels us to back off from the world when they tell us that we don't know what we're talking about and when we believe the Bible. Believing the Bible is still, and what God says in here, in the beginning God created, is still the most scientific thing you can say about creation. Not just theological, but scientific. We're out of time. We're done. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we do thank and praise you for this time we've had together, not just this evening, but these many, many weeks of looking and seeing both what your word has to say and what creation itself has to say concerning you and what you've done and what you've created. We thank you that we don't have to be buffaloed by the lies of the futile speculations of the world and those who profess to be wise, and yet they're darkened in their understanding. We thank you, Lord, that we can believe your word as written and believe what we see in what you've created, and that you have done it all to your glory. And we just pray, Lord, that those around us that we know and care about would begin to, and haven't come to see you and to know you, would see and believe and humble their hearts before you, fall to their knees and on their faces, bow down to you and receive our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, that they might live. We thank you for all these things you've shown us. We thank you for all these things in Jesus' name and for his glory.